In the autumn of 1942, beneath the cold skies of occupied Belgium, an elderly woman sat in her living room window, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm that had become as familiar to the Nazi soldiers on patrol as the church bells that rang each Sunday. What those soldiers never realized, what they couldn't possibly comprehend as they marched past her cottage day after day, was that every loop of yarn, every dropped stitch, every change in pattern was a coded message being woven into a scarf, a message that detailed the exact number of German supply trains passing through the nearby junction, the types of cargo they carried, and the precise times of their movements. This wasn't just an old woman passing time. This was a spy network operating in plain sight, using the most innocent weapon imaginable, knitting needles. The story you're about to hear is one that has been deliberately buried in the footnotes of World War II history, a tale of courage so audacious and clever that it sounds like fiction. But it's real. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Allied intelligence officers called these women the most valuable assets they had in occupied Europe, and why the Nazis, despite their obsessive attention to detail and their brutal efficiency, never saw them coming. You'll discover how housewives, grandmothers, and seamstresses turned something as ordinary as knitting into a weapon that helped turn the tide of war, and how their contributions were systematically erased from the history books for reasons that will make your blood boil. Belgium in 1940 had fallen to the Nazi war machine in just 18 days. 18 days to crush a nation. The occupation that followed was brutal and thorough. German forces controlled every major city, every railway line, every communication hub. The country became a vital logistics center for the Third Reich, with supply trains running constantly from Germany through Belgium toward the Western Front. These trains carried everything: tanks, ammunition, troops, fuel, controlled the railways, and you controlled the flow of war. The Nazis knew this, which is why they guarded every station, every junction, every bridge with fanatical intensity. Informants were everywhere. Trust no one became the unspoken rule of survival. Anyone caught spying faced immediate execution, often along with their entire family. The message was clear: resist and die. But resistance took many forms, and not all of them looked like sabotage or armed rebellion. In the small towns and villages that dotted the Belgian countryside, women continued their daily routines because they had no choice. They shopped for what little food the rationing allowed. They attended church. They gathered in small groups to knit and sew, activities that had been part of their lives long before the war and would continue regardless of who occupied their country. To the German soldiers stationed in these towns, these women were invisible. They were background noise, old ladies doing old lady things. The soldiers saw no threat in a knitting circle. They saw no danger in women who spent their afternoons by windows, needles clicking away as they created scarves and sweaters for the coming winter. What the Nazis failed to understand was that these women had been watching. They had been counting. They lived near the railways, near the stations, near the supply depots. They saw everything, every troop movement, every supply train, every change in routine. And they understood something that would prove fatal to German operations. Information is only valuable if you can transmit it. The resistance needed eyes on the railways, but more importantly, they needed a way to send that information to Allied intelligence without arousing suspicion. Traditional methods were too dangerous. Radio transmissions could be traced. Couriers could be stopped and searched. Written messages could be intercepted. They needed something new, something so innocent, so ordinary, so beneath suspicion that it could pass right under the noses of the Gestapo. The answer came from an unexpected source: a retired schoolteacher named Mathilde Carré, and a network of women who understood that patterns could mean more than decoration. They developed a code, intricate and brilliant, hidden within the stitches themselves. A pearl stitch might represent a passenger train, a knit stitch, a freight car. A dropped stitch could indicate a delay. The color of yarn signaled the day of the week. The length of a row corresponded to the number of cars in a convoy. An entire intelligence report could be knitted into a single scarf, then worn openly, transported across checkpoints and delivered to resistance contacts who would unravel the message and transmit it to London. The Germans were looking for papers, for radios, for weapons. They never thought to look at knitting. The system was elegant in its simplicity, but developing it required weeks of careful planning and an understanding of how the Nazi occupation forces operated. The women who created this knitting code weren't trained spies. They were teachers, shopkeepers, seamstresses, mothers and grandmothers who had lived ordinary lives until the occupation forced them to become extraordinary. They met in living rooms and church basements, ostensibly to pool their limited yarn supplies and share patterns, activities the Germans actively encouraged because it kept the population docile and occupied. But these gatherings served a dual purpose. While their hands worked the needles, their minds worked on something far more dangerous, creating a language that could hide in plain sight. The genius of the code lay in its flexibility and its ordinariness. A scarf being knitted could contain multiple layers of information depending on how you read it. The base pattern established the location. Different stitch combinations represented different railway junctions across Belgium. The variations within that pattern told the story of what passed through. A series of cable stitches might indicate armored units. A lace pattern could signal fuel transports. Even the tension of the stitches mattered. Tight stitches meant high security at the station. Loose stitches suggested minimal guards. To anyone without the key, it was just a scarf. Perhaps not the most beautiful scarf, with its odd irregularities and seemingly random pattern changes, but nothing that would raise an alarm. The women deliberately made their work look amateurish, full of the small mistakes that any casual knitter might make. But the code was only half the battle. The information still needed to reach Allied intelligence, and this required a network of couriers and safe houses stretching from the Belgian countryside all the way to neutral Switzerland and eventually to London. The knitted items themselves became the messages. A scarf would be completed, then gifted to a neighbor who happened to be traveling to visit family. That neighbor would wear it openly through German checkpoints, enduring searches that looked through bags and pockets, but never thought to examine the pattern of the clothing being worn. At the destination, another member of the network would receive the gift, carefully document the pattern, then unravel the stitches to destroy the evidence. The information would be encoded again, this time in more traditional formats, and passed along the chain until it reached British intelligence officers who maintained the master key to decode the knitting patterns. The risk was constant and absolute. The Gestapo was everywhere, paranoid and brutal in their search for resistance activities. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Children were questioned about what their parents discussed at home. Anyone caught with suspicious materials faced torture and execution. The women in the knitting network knew that a single mistake, one moment of carelessness, could doom not just themselves, but everyone connected to them. They developed elaborate precautions. Knitting circles never met in the same location twice in a row. The codes changed regularly. If a woman sensed she was being watched, she would destroy her work immediately and claim she had simply run out of yarn. Some carried small scissors in their pockets at all times, ready to cut apart any evidence in seconds if necessary. The network's first major success came in January of 1943, when a knitted shawl documented the movement of an entire panzer division through the Namur railway junction over a 72-hour period. The information included not just numbers, but also the condition of the equipment, noted through deliberate imperfections in the stitching. British intelligence received the decoded information within 6 days, an almost miraculous speed for that era. 2 weeks later, Allied bombers struck the railway junction at the exact moment a resupply convoy was stopped there, destroying enough material to outfit 3 tank battalions. The Germans never understood how the Allies had known. They investigated everyone, railway workers, shopkeepers, even their own soldiers. They never looked at the old women knitting by their windows. The success of that first major strike transformed the knitting network from an experimental operation into a critical intelligence asset, but it also brought new dangers. German counterintelligence officers began to suspect that information was leaking from the railway corridors, even if they couldn't identify the source. Security tightened dramatically. Checkpoints became more thorough. Random house searches increased. The Gestapo arrested dozens of suspected resistance members, interrogating them with methods designed to break even the strongest will. Several railway workers disappeared overnight, never to be seen again. The net was closing and the women knew it. Yet they continued their work, understanding that every day they operated was another day they could provide the Allies with information that saved lives and shortened the war. The woman at the center of this network, the one who had conceived the original code, was a 58-year-old former mathematics teacher named Leonie van Houte. Before the war, she had lived a quiet life in the town of Tournai, teaching algebra and geometry to children who would rather be anywhere else. Her husband had died in the First World War, and she had never remarried, dedicating herself instead to her students and her garden. She was unremarkable in every way that mattered to the occupiers, too old to be a threat, too provincial to be sophisticated, too ordinary to warrant a second glance. This invisibility became her greatest weapon. Leonie understood patterns in a way few people did. She saw the mathematical relationships in everything, including the rhythms of military logistics. She recognized that supply trains ran on predictable schedules, that patterns emerged in how the Germans moved material, and that these patterns could be documented and exploited. Leonie recruited carefully, choosing women she had known for years, women whose hatred of the occupation was matched only by their ability to remain calm under pressure. She taught them the code in small groups, never revealing the full network to any single member. Each woman knew only her immediate contacts, a security measure that would limit the damage if anyone was captured and broken under interrogation. The meetings were disguised as prayer groups, sewing circles, or simple social gatherings among old friends. Leonie would demonstrate a new stitch pattern, explaining it as something she had learned from a magazine or remembered from her childhood. The other women would practice, their fingers learning the movements until they became automatic. Only later, in the privacy of their own homes, would they realize that the pattern Leonie had taught them corresponded to a specific type of military transport or a particular security protocol. The network expanded beyond Tournai, spreading to other railway towns across Belgium. By the spring of 1943, more than 40 women were actively knitting intelligence reports, covering every major railway junction in the country. They developed specialized roles within the network. Some women focused on observation, positioning themselves where they could watch the trains without arousing suspicion. Others became encoders, taking verbal reports and translating them into knitted patterns. Still others served as couriers, moving the finished items through the network. The system was decentralized and resilient. If one cell was compromised, the others could continue operating. The Germans were hunting for a traditional spy ring, looking for radio operators and document forgers. They never imagined they were looking for grandmothers with knitting needles. But in May of 1943, disaster struck. A courier named Marie Blom was stopped at a checkpoint outside Brussels. She was carrying 3 scarves in her bag, gifts she claimed were for her nieces. The German soldiers, bored and looking for any excuse to harass civilians, decided to examine the scarves more closely. One soldier, more observant than most, noticed that the patterns seemed unusual, almost deliberately irregular. He couldn't articulate what bothered him about them, but his instincts told him something was wrong. Marie was detained for questioning. The scarves were confiscated, and for the first time since its creation, the knitting network faced the possibility of complete exposure. Marie Blom sat in the cold interrogation room for 6 hours, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining her composure. She was 34 years old, a widow with 2 children, and she understood exactly what was at stake. If the Germans broke her, if she revealed even a single name or detail about the network, dozens of women would die. The Gestapo officer across from her was methodical and patient, asking the same questions over and over, looking for inconsistencies in her story. Where had she gotten the scarves? Who had made them? Why were the patterns so irregular? Marie stuck to her prepared answer. She had knitted them herself. She was not a skilled knitter. The irregularities were simply mistakes. She played the role of a simple, slightly dim-witted woman who could barely understand why she was being questioned at all. The performance saved her life. The scarves were sent to German intelligence analysts in Brussels, specialists who examined everything from intercepted letters to suspicious documents. These analysts looked at the scarves for 3 days, searching for hidden messages in the traditional ways: invisible ink, microdots, encoded text woven into labels. They found nothing because they were looking for the wrong things. The idea that the knitting itself could be the message, that the stitches themselves formed a code, never occurred to them. It was too unconventional, too domestic, too absurdly simple. After 72 hours, the scarves were classified as harmless and returned to Marie along with a warning about wasting German time with poor quality handicrafts. She was released. The network had survived its closest brush with exposure, but the incident sent shockwaves through every cell. Leonie immediately ordered a 2-week suspension of all activities while they assessed the damage and refined their security protocols. During those 2 weeks of silence, Leonie redesigned the entire system. The codes became even more subtle, embedded deeper within patterns that appeared more conventionally attractive. She recruited 2 professional seamstresses who taught the network members how to knit with greater technical skill, making their work look more polished and therefore less suspicious. The courier routes were changed, with items now moving through multiple handoffs rather than direct transfers. Most importantly, Leonie created a failsafe. If anyone was arrested, the entire network would immediately switch to a backup code that had been memorized but never used. This way, even if the Germans somehow cracked the original system, the intelligence flow would continue uninterrupted after a brief pause. The changes made the network slower, but far more secure. When operations resumed in June of 1943, the network's intelligence became even more valuable. Allied planners were preparing for what would eventually become the invasion of Normandy, and they needed detailed information about German rail capacity, supply routes and troop movements throughout occupied Europe. The knitting network provided a steady stream of data that painted a comprehensive picture of Nazi logistics in Belgium. A sweater documented the movement of an entire infantry division over 10 days. A pair of gloves detailed the security arrangements at a fuel depot. A baby blanket, innocent and sweet, contained information about ammunition shipments that led to a successful sabotage operation by the Belgian resistance. Each item was a small piece of a much larger puzzle that Allied intelligence was assembling. The women themselves never knew the full impact of their work. They received no recognition, no medals, no acknowledgement beyond coded messages thanking them for their contributions. They lived under constant threat, watching their neighbors disappear into Gestapo custody. Hearing the screams from interrogation centers, seeing the public executions meant to terrify the population into submission. They knitted through air raids and rationing, through the fear and the grief and the endless grey monotony of occupation. Their fingers kept moving, their needles kept clicking, and the information kept flowing to London. By the end of 1943, the knitting network had documented over 200 significant military movements, contributing to dozens of successful Allied operations. And the Germans still had no idea these women existed. The winter of 1943 brought new challenges that had nothing to do with German security. Yarn became almost impossible to find. The occupation had stripped Belgium of resources, and luxury items like knitting supplies were no longer imported or manufactured. The women faced an impossible dilemma. They needed to continue their intelligence work, but they had nothing to knit with. Leonie solved the problem with characteristic ingenuity. The network began unraveling old sweaters, blankets, and clothing that were beyond repair, salvaging the yarn and re-dyeing it with homemade dyes created from vegetables and berries. The resulting colors were often strange and inconsistent, but this actually helped the coding system. A shift from dark gray to lighter gray within the same piece could now indicate a change in cargo type or a switch in railway routes. Scarcity had accidentally made their code more sophisticated. As 1944 arrived and the momentum of the war began shifting toward the Allies, the Germans became increasingly paranoid and brutal. They knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know when or where. Security measures intensified across all of occupied Europe. Random executions increased. Collective punishment became standard policy, where entire neighborhoods would be punished for the actions of a single resistance member. The knitting network adapted by becoming even more cautious, sometimes going weeks without transmitting information if the risk seemed too high. But they never stopped completely. Leonie impressed upon every member that their silence meant Allied soldiers would die from lack of intelligence. The weight of that responsibility kept them working even when every instinct screamed to stop, to hide, to save themselves. The network's most significant contribution came in March of 1944, 3 months before D-Day. There, a woman named Josephine Martens, who lived near the Liège railway complex, noticed something unusual over a period of 2 weeks. The normal military traffic had been joined by hospital trains, dozens of them, moving east toward Germany. These trains carried wounded soldiers, thousands of them, and the volume suggested something catastrophic had happened on the Eastern Front. Josephine documented everything she saw: the number of trains, the estimated number of wounded per car, even the insignia on the hospital personnel she could observe from her window. She encoded this information into a shawl with a pattern so complex it took her 11 days to complete. The item made its way through the courier network and reached British intelligence within 3 weeks. That single piece of knitted intelligence confirmed what Allied analysts had suspected but couldn't verify. The German army was being devastated on the Eastern Front, bleeding resources and manpower at an unsustainable rate. The hospital trains meant the Wehrmacht was weaker than German propaganda claimed, stretched thinner than their operational security suggested. This information influenced Allied planning for the Normandy invasion, convincing commanders that the Germans would struggle to reinforce the Atlantic Wall if faced with a major assault. The intelligence from a grandmother with knitting needles helped shape one of the most important military decisions of the entire war. Josephine Martens never knew this. She simply continued watching the trains and knitting her reports, believing she was doing her small part to resist the occupation. By May of 1944, the knitting network had expanded to 73 women across Belgium. They had documented over 400 military movements, contributed to 17 successful Allied bombing raids, and provided intelligence that saved countless lives. They had done all of this while living under one of the most oppressive occupation regimes in modern history, under constant threat of discovery, torture, and execution. They had transformed the most domestic of activities into a weapon of war. And yet, even as Allied forces prepared to liberate Europe, even as the end of the Nazi occupation drew near, these women remained invisible. Their contribution was known only to a handful of intelligence officers in London, who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. June 6, 1944 arrived with the thunder of Allied bombers crossing the Channel toward Normandy, and across Belgium the knitting network waited in tense silence, listening to BBC radio broadcasts that spoke in careful code about the invasion they had helped make possible. The women understood that their work had reached a critical phase. As Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, German supply lines through Belgium would become even more vital to the Nazi war effort. The Wehrmacht would desperately need to move reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel through the very railway junctions these women had been monitoring for 2 years. Every piece of intelligence they could provide now would help Allied commanders interdict those supplies, strangle the German response, and save the lives of soldiers fighting their way across France. The needles kept clicking, faster now, more urgently, as if the women could somehow knit victory itself into their patterns. The German response to D-Day brought chaos to the occupation, and chaos brought opportunity. Officers who had been stationed in quiet Belgian towns were suddenly reassigned to the front. Security protocols that had been rigidly enforced for years began to slip as the Wehrmacht prioritized military necessity over civilian control. Railway stations that had been heavily guarded now operated with skeleton crews. The knitting network exploited these gaps ruthlessly. Women who had previously only observed from a distance now positioned themselves closer to the platforms, sometimes even inside the stations themselves, claiming they were waiting for delayed passenger trains or seeking information about relatives. They saw more, documented more, transmitted more intelligence in the 3 months following D-Day than in the previous year combined. A lace tablecloth created by 5 different women working in sequence documented the complete railway schedule for the Charleroi Junction over a 14-day period, including emergency military transports that had been added to support the desperate German defense in France. But the increased activity brought increased risk, and in August of 1944, the network suffered its first catastrophic loss. 3 women in the Mons cell were arrested simultaneously after an informant whose identity was never discovered, provided the Gestapo with enough information to connect them to resistance activities. The women were Francine Dumont, age 41, Helena Rousseau, age 56, and Catherine Petit, age 62. They were interrogated for 5 days in conditions designed to break the human spirit. The Gestapo used every method at their disposal: physical torture, threats against family members, false promises of clemency. The 3 women revealed nothing. Not a single name, not one detail about the coding system, not even an acknowledgement that such a network existed. On August 19, 1944, all 3 were executed by firing squad in the courtyard of Mons prison. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The Gestapo never learned that they had captured members of one of the most effective intelligence networks in occupied Belgium. They died believing they were simply punishing random resistance sympathizers. The 3 women took the secret of the knitting code to their graves, and in doing so, they saved the lives of 70 other women who continued the work. The executions devastated Leonie van Houte, who had recruited all 3 women personally and considered them friends as much as comrades. She had sent them into danger, had asked them to risk everything, and now they were dead. For the first time since creating the network, Leonie questioned whether the intelligence was worth the human cost. She spent 3 days alone in her house, not knitting, not meeting with anyone, simply sitting by her window and staring at the street where German soldiers still patrolled as if they owned the world. But on the 4th day, she picked up her needles again. She understood something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Francine, Helena, and Catherine had not died in vain, but they had died for her idea, and she owed it to them to see that idea through to the end. The network would continue. The intelligence would flow. The knitting needles would keep clicking until Belgium was free. September brought the first whispers of liberation as Allied forces advanced rapidly through France and into Belgium itself. The German occupation, so absolute and terrifying for 4 years, began to crumble with stunning speed. Wehrmacht units retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape encirclement. The knitting network's final reports documented this collapse. Trains running half empty, stations abandoned, the entire logistics system falling apart. On September 2nd, 1944, British forces entered Brussels. Within days, most of Belgium was liberated. The women of the knitting network set down their needles, burned their code books, and tried to return to lives that no longer existed. The world they had known before the war was gone. The people they had been before becoming spies could never be recovered. They had survived, but survival came with a weight that few people outside the resistance could understand. They had done extraordinary things, and now they would have to live as ordinary people once again, carrying secrets that could never be fully shared. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, as Belgium celebrated its freedom with a joy that bordered on delirium, the women of the knitting network expected some form of recognition for their contribution to the Allied victory. British intelligence officers who had worked with them throughout the occupation promised that their service would be documented, that medals would be issued, that their names would be recorded in the official histories of the war. Leonie van Houte herself was interviewed multiple times by military historians who seemed genuinely impressed by the ingenuity and effectiveness of the knitting code. She provided detailed accounts of how the system worked, the women who had participated, the intelligence they had gathered, and the operations their information had supported. The historians took notes, asked careful questions, and assured her that this remarkable story would not be forgotten. Leonie believed them. She had no reason not to. These were Allied officers, representatives of the nations that had liberated Belgium, and surely they understood the value of what had been accomplished. But as the months passed, and Europe began the long process of rebuilding, something strange happened to the story of the knitting network. The official reports that mentioned their contribution began to be classified at higher and higher security levels. The medals that had been promised never materialized. The women who inquired about recognition were told politely but firmly that their service had been noted and appreciated, but that public acknowledgement was impossible for reasons of national security. The explanation made no sense. The war was over, the Germans had been defeated. What national security interest could possibly be served by keeping the knitting network secret? Leonie pressed for answers, writing letters to British intelligence, to Belgian government officials, to anyone who might listen. She received carefully worded responses that said nothing of substance. "Thank you for your service. Your contribution was valuable. Further discussion is not possible at this time." The bureaucratic stonewalling was maddening, but it was also absolute. The truth, which Leonie would not learn until decades later, was that British intelligence had decided the knitting code was too valuable to reveal, even in victory. Military planners understood that future conflicts would require similar intelligence networks in occupied territories, and the knitting method was so simple, so elegant, and so effective that it could be replicated in any culture where textile work was common. If the story became public, if the method was explained in history books and newspaper articles, it would lose its power. Future enemies would know to watch for it. The advantage would be lost. So the decision was made at the highest levels of British and American intelligence. The knitting network would be erased from the official history. The women would receive no medals, no public recognition, no acknowledgement beyond vague commendations buried in classified files. Their contribution would be a secret kept not from enemies, but from history itself. It was, the officials reasoned, a necessary sacrifice for future operational security. The women who had risked everything, who had watched friends die, who had lived in terror for years, would have to be content with knowing they had done their duty. Public glory was not part of that duty. Leonie fought this decision with every resource available to her, but she was a retired schoolteacher in a devastated country, and she had no power against the institutional weight of military bureaucracy. She wrote her own account of the network, a detailed manuscript that explained the code, named the participants and documented the intelligence they had provided. She submitted it to publishers in Belgium, France, and England. Every single one rejected it, often with regretful letters explaining that they had been advised by government officials that publication would not be in the national interest. Some publishers were more direct. They had been threatened with prosecution under official secrets laws if they released the story. Leonie's manuscript became another casualty of the classification system, locked away in a drawer where it would remain for over 30 years. She continued teaching mathematics after the war, returning to the classroom as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent years running one of the most effective intelligence networks in occupied Europe. Her students had no idea that the quiet woman explaining geometry theorems had once encoded military secrets into knitting patterns. The other women of the network faced similar frustrations. They had expected to be remembered, to have their sacrifice acknowledged, to take their place in the story of Belgian resistance. Instead, they were forgotten, their contribution reduced to a footnote that never appeared in any book. Some of them tried to tell their stories to local newspapers or community groups, but they were always met with skepticism. The tale seemed too fantastic, too much like a spy novel to be real. Without official confirmation, without documentation, without any form of verification, their accounts were dismissed as exaggerations or fantasies. The women who had been so careful, so disciplined, so successful at keeping their secret during the war, now found that very secrecy working against them. They had hidden too well. They had been too invisible. And now, in peace, that invisibility had become permanent. They grew old in obscurity, watching as historians wrote about the resistance, about spies and saboteurs and heroes, and never once mentioned the grandmothers with knitting needles who had helped win the war. Leonie van Hout died in 1971 at the age of 85, taking with her the full knowledge of how many lives the knitting network had saved and how many operations their intelligence had enabled. She died without recognition, without the historical acknowledgement she had fought for, surrounded by former students who remembered her as a kind teacher but knew nothing of her wartime heroism. Her obituary in the local Tournai newspaper mentioned that she had lived through both world wars and had been active in her community, but it said nothing about resistance work or intelligence gathering. The manuscript she had written, the detailed account of the network and its operations, remained in a desk drawer in her small apartment. Her niece discovered it while sorting through Leonie's belongings, and not understanding its significance, nearly threw it away with other old papers. Only a chance comment from a neighbor who vaguely remembered rumors about Leonie's wartime activities convinced the niece to preserve the document. It sat in an attic for another 12 years, yellowing and forgotten, a complete record of an intelligence operation that had helped change the course of the war, gathering dust alongside old photograph albums and broken furniture. The breakthrough came in 1983, not through official channels or historical research, but through the persistence of a journalist named Claire Mortier, who was investigating Belgian women's contributions to the resistance. Mortier had heard fragments of stories about women using coded knitting, but every time she tried to verify the accounts, she hit walls of official silence and missing documentation. She filed freedom of information requests with the Belgian government, the British Ministry of Defense, and American military archives. Most were denied. Some were partially released with so much redacted text that they were meaningless. But one request, filed with the newly accessible records of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, yielded a treasure trove. Buried in a file labeled as Routine Intelligence Assessments was a report from 1944 that praised the effectiveness of a network identified only as Operation Needlework. The report detailed how the network had provided actionable intelligence on German railway operations, credited them with contributing to successful air raids, and recommended continued support for their activities. It was the first official documentation that proved the knitting network had existed and had been valued by Allied intelligence. Armed with this evidence, Mortier renewed her search with new energy and focus. She tracked down surviving members of the network, women now in their 70s and 80s, who had never stopped hoping that someone would finally listen to their stories. They opened up to her in ways they hadn't been able to for decades, showing her the few pieces of their coded work that they had secretly kept, despite orders to destroy everything. One woman, Simone Verbeke, had preserved a small sample square of knitting that demonstrated the basic code structure. She had hidden it inside the lining of an old coat for 39 years, unable to throw away the only physical proof that her wartime service had been real. Mortier photographed the sample, documented the code system, and interviewed 14 surviving network members over a period of 8 months. She found Leonie's manuscript in the attic and recognized it immediately as the cornerstone document she needed. The story was finally coming together, but Mortier soon discovered that publishing it would be almost as difficult as uncovering it had been. British intelligence officials, when contacted for comment on Mortier's research, initially refused to acknowledge that Operation Needlework had ever existed. Only when she threatened to publish without their cooperation did they agree to limited discussions, and even then, they attempted to convince her that revealing the knitting code would compromise ongoing intelligence methods. Mortier argued correctly that the code was 40 years old, and that modern surveillance technology had made such low-tech methods obsolete. The officials eventually relented, providing minimal confirmation of the network's existence, but refusing to declassify the full operational records. It was enough. Mortier's article, published in Le Soir in December of 1983, was the first public account of the knitting network. It ran over 3 full pages, included photographs of the surviving women, and featured a detailed explanation of how the code had worked. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Historians who had spent decades studying the Belgian resistance were stunned. How had this story remained hidden for so long? How had such an effective and innovative intelligence operation been completely omitted from the historical record? The article sparked a wave of recognition that came too late for most of the women who had served in the network. Of the 73 women who had participated, only 19 were still alive in 1983. The Belgian government, embarrassed by the decades of silence, finally issued formal commendations and medals to the survivors and posthumous recognition to those who had died. British officials grudgingly acknowledged the network's contribution in carefully worded statements that still avoided revealing too much operational detail. American military historians began incorporating the story into their accounts of intelligence operations during World War II. But for the women themselves, the recognition felt hollow. 14 of them, including Francine Dumont, Helena Rousseau, and Catherine Petit, who had been executed in Mons, never received any acknowledgement at all. Their families learned about their heroism from a newspaper article published 4 decades after the war ended. The injustice of it, the systematic erasure of their contribution, remained a wound that official apologies could not heal. The revelation of the Knitting Network story in 1983 opened a flood of similar accounts that had been suppressed or ignored for decades. Historians began discovering that the Belgian women were not unique. Similar networks had operated in France, using embroidery patterns to encode information about German fortifications along the Atlantic Wall. In Norway, women had used traditional weaving techniques to document the movements of Nazi naval vessels. In the Netherlands, lacemakers had created intricate patterns that mapped the locations of German artillery positions. The systematic suppression of these stories revealed a disturbing pattern in how the contributions of women to the war effort had been recorded, or more accurately, deliberately not recorded. Male-dominated intelligence agencies and military hierarchies had classified these operations not out of genuine security concerns, but because acknowledging them would have challenged the narrative of warfare as an exclusively masculine domain. The spies were supposed to be dashing men parachuting behind enemy lines, not grandmothers with knitting needles sitting by their windows. The weapons of war were supposed to be guns and explosives, not yarn and patterns passed between housewives at church socials. This realization sparked a broader re-evaluation of women's roles in World War II resistance movements across Europe. Academic researchers, many of them women who had grown frustrated with male-centric military history, began systematically searching for these hidden stories in archives across Europe and America. They found them everywhere. Courier networks run entirely by women who transported weapons and documents by hiding them in baby carriages and shopping baskets. Safe houses maintained by elderly women whose age and gender made them invisible to occupation forces. Intelligence gathering operations conducted by women who worked as cleaning staff in German offices and carefully memorized the documents they saw while emptying trash bins. The volume of evidence was staggering, and it all pointed to the same conclusion. Women had been absolutely central to resistance operations throughout occupied Europe, but their contributions had been systematically minimized, classified, or simply ignored in the historical record. The Knitting Network story became a catalyst for correcting decades of historical erasure. For the surviving members of the Belgian Knitting Network, the belated recognition brought mixed emotions. Simone Verbeek, who was 81 when Mortier's article was published, expressed gratitude that the story was finally being told, but also profound anger at the decades of silence. She spoke publicly about watching men who had performed far less dangerous resistance work receive medals and public honors immediately after the war, while she and her fellow knitters were told to forget what they had done. She described the psychological toll of carrying a secret that significant for so long, of having survived something extraordinary but being unable to share it, of watching the war being commemorated in ways that erased her contribution. Her testimony, along with that of other survivors, revealed that the suppression of their story had inflicted a second trauma on top of the trauma of the occupation itself. They had endured the fear, the danger, the loss of friends to Gestapo execution, and then they had been forced to endure invisibility and dismissal when peace finally came. The Belgian government's response to these revelations was complicated by political sensitivities about how the country's wartime collaboration and resistance had been remembered. Belgium's post-war narrative had focused heavily on celebrated resistance figures, almost all of them men, while glossing over the extent of civilian collaboration with the occupation. The Knitting Network story challenged this narrative in uncomfortable ways. It showed that resistance had been more widespread, more creative, and more effective than official histories had acknowledged, and it raised questions about why some forms of resistance had been celebrated, while others had been buried. Government officials attempted to frame the new recognition as simply correcting an unfortunate oversight, but historians and journalists were not willing to let them off so easily. This had not been an oversight. It had been a deliberate policy decision made by intelligence agencies who valued operational secrecy over historical truth, and supported by governments who found it convenient to minimize women's contributions to a war effort that was supposed to have been won primarily by male soldiers and traditional military force. The impact of the story extended beyond historical correction and into contemporary discussions about women's roles in military and intelligence services. In the 1980s, Western militaries were still heavily male-dominated and resistant to expanding opportunities for women in combat and intelligence roles. The knitting network became a powerful argument against these restrictions. Here was documented proof that women could conduct sophisticated intelligence operations under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable, that they could maintain operational security better than many traditional spy networks, and that they could make decisive contributions to military success. The story was cited in policy debates in the United States, Britain, and across Europe as evidence that excluding women from intelligence and military roles was not just discriminatory, but strategically foolish. The women who had knitted coded messages 40 years earlier became unlikely symbols in contemporary battles over gender equality in national security institutions. Their story, which had been suppressed to protect intelligence methods, was now being used to challenge institutional sexism in the very agencies that had suppressed it. Today, more than 80 years after Leonie van Houte first conceived of encoding intelligence into knitting patterns, the story of the Belgian knitting network stands as one of the most remarkable examples of ingenuity and courage in the history of modern warfare. But it also stands as a cautionary tale about how history is written, who gets remembered and who gets erased. The women who risked their lives conducting this operation did not fit the traditional narrative of wartime heroism. They were not soldiers charging into battle. They were not agents parachuting behind enemy lines or engaging in dramatic shootouts with the Gestapo. They were ordinary people, mostly elderly, doing something that looked completely mundane while conducting one of the most effective intelligence operations of World War II. Their invisibility was their weapon during the war, but after the war, that same invisibility became their curse. The very qualities that made them effective spies, their ordinariness, their domesticity, their age and gender, made it easy for historians and officials to overlook their contributions or dismiss them as insignificant compared to more conventionally dramatic acts of resistance. The last surviving member of the knitting network, a woman named Marguerite Deschamps, died in 2006 at the age of 97. Before her death, she gave a final interview to a Belgian television documentary crew in which she reflected on her wartime service and its aftermath. She spoke without bitterness, but with a clarity that cut through decades of official obfuscation. She said that she and her fellow knitters had never expected glory or public recognition while they were doing the work. They had expected to be killed by the Gestapo, and they had accepted that risk because they believed their intelligence was saving Allied lives. What they had not expected, what they could not have imagined, was that they would survive the war only to be told that their survival required their silence, that acknowledging their contribution would somehow endanger future operations. She called it the second betrayal, worse in some ways than the occupation itself, because it came from the very people they had risked everything to help. Her words became a powerful indictment of how intelligence agencies and military institutions had treated the women who had served them with such courage and creativity. The knitting network story has found new relevance in the 21st century as intelligence agencies grapple with the challenges of gathering information in societies with advanced surveillance technology. The fundamental insight of Leonie van Houte's code, that intelligence can be hidden in plain sight within culturally accepted activities, remains as valid today as it was in 1942. Modern intelligence training now includes case studies of the knitting network as an example of effective low-tech tradecraft that succeeded precisely because it seemed so unthreatening and ordinary. The operation is taught alongside more famous intelligence successes like the breaking of the Enigma code or the deception operations around D-Day, finally taking its place in the canon of World War II intelligence history. Younger generations of intelligence officers, many of them women, have embraced the knitting network as proof that the most effective intelligence work often comes from thinking outside traditional paradigms and recognizing that power can come from unexpected places and unexpected people. In Tournai, where Leonie van Houte lived and taught and ran her network, there is now a small memorial in the town square. It features a bronze statue of an elderly woman sitting with knitting needles, her eyes looking toward the railway line that still runs through the town. The plaque at the base lists the names of all 73 women who participated in the network, including the 3 who were executed in Mons in 1944. Local schools bring children to the memorial as part of their history curriculum, teaching a new generation about how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. The statue has become a gathering place for knitters who sometimes sit on the benches nearby and work on their projects, a living continuation of the tradition that was once used as a weapon against tyranny. It is a small memorial, nothing grand or imposing, but it serves its purpose, ensuring that the women who clicked their needles in defiance of occupation are finally, permanently remembered. The story of the knitting network matters today because it challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about history, about heroism, about who gets to be remembered and why. It reminds us that the most important contributions are sometimes the ones that remain invisible until someone has the courage and persistence to bring them into the light. It shows us that powerful institutions will suppress stories that don't fit their preferred narratives, and that correcting the historical record requires constant vigilance and willingness to challenge official accounts. Most importantly, it proves that ordinary people armed with nothing more than creativity, courage, and conviction can change the course of history. The next time you see someone knitting, remember that those needles were once weapons, that those patterns once saved lives, and that the hands creating them belonged to women who understood that sometimes the quietest resistance is the most powerful. Their story was buried for 40 years, but it could not be buried forever. The truth, like yarn in skilled hands, always finds a way to be woven into the pattern.